But we've got an excellent panel today to talk about what is happening in the global landscape. We're going to start with Harry Broadman, who's the Senior Vice President of Albright Stonebridge. Has his resumes, as are the other panelists, are in your documents. Very impressive background. He's worked in Africa, Russia, China, and really many of the exciting markets in the world. He'll be followed by James Manyika, who has some very, very interesting views on how the U.S. multinationals are reacting to the South-South trade. And then lastly, Gideon Rachman, who's known to many of us as the most interesting column in the FT Daily, and as a new book that's outside that we can talk about. Harry arrived from India this morning, Gideon last night from Brazil. I was in Indonesia last week, and James had the pleasure of being in Spain, the undeveloping market, last week. So we've got some pretty interesting global perspectives, and we're going to kick this off right away with Harry on South-South trade.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
If you don't mind, they'll be speaking about 10 minutes each. If you can write your comments down and pass your questions to the outside, we'll have time for your Q&A at the end of their prepared remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think we're going to stay at our seats here to keep it informal as a conversation. What I would like to do in my time is give some perspective about commerce among developing countries, that is South-South commerce, and by commerce I'm talking about both trade and foreign direct investment. It's probably striking news for many to realize that there has been tremendous growth in South-South trade and investment as opposed to trade and investment among the North, among the advanced countries, or North-South trade and investment. In fact, South-South trade has grown 10% per year between 1990 and 2001, which is twice as fast as total global trade. And as a share of world trade, trade among the South stood at about 8% in 1990 and doubled by 2007 to 16%. Another illustrative fact is that the share of exports coming out of developing countries going to developing countries rose from about 29% in 1990 to almost 50% in 2008. That is, almost half of the exports coming out of developing countries went to developing countries. I think what might be the epitome of this growth in South-South commerce, and in particular trade, is what is happening between China and India and Brazil on the one hand, and sub-Saharan Africa on the other. Over the period of 1995 and 2008, merchandise trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the developing world rose by a factor of 7. Trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the developed world over that same period, 1995 and 2008, rose by a factor of only 3. Gives you a sense of the proportions. Now, you might ask, why is South-South trade exploding? The answer is quite simple, I think, and again, I think the case of sub-Saharan Africa and its trade with the other southern countries I've mentioned is quite illustrative. Africa, in fact, is growing tremendously. The core countries of Africa, of sub-Saharan Africa, have been registering growth for the last decade and a half of more than 6% in real terms of GDP on an annual basis. And the countries from the south that I've mentioned recognize that. The companies domiciled in the north frankly, don't recognize that. So there's real economic success stories on the continent of Africa, which the multinationals from the south recognize. Multinationals from the north have not yet recognized that fully. In fact, the number I've mentioned about growth of 6% per annum in sub-Saharan Africa, that pertains not to the resource-rich countries. In fact, it pertains to the countries that are not the oil exporters. And that represents 40% of the population on the continent. It's even higher when you look at the oil exporters. I like to think, or I like to term for the northern multinationals Africa as the continent of economic misperceptions. But it's important to keep what is going on in South-South trade and investment in perspective, and not to overstate it, what's happening. And as a good economist, I distinguish, and I want you to distinguish, between levels and flow rates. And in particular, if you look at the numbers behind what I've just illustrated in terms of Africa and Brazil and India and China, I said that the flow rates were 7 times versus 3 times, but if you look at the actual volume of trade, the merchandise trade between sub-Saharan Africa and developed countries was about 600 billion US, but between the developing countries, it was about 280 million, okay? So the growth rates are tremendous, but the levels in South-South trade are much lower. In terms of foreign direct investment, the conventional wisdom is, if you were to ask anyone in Africa, or I dare say maybe even in this room who study the issue of South-South investment, is, well, gee, the Indians and the Brazilians and the Chinese are dominating the African economy. The fact is that 90% of the cumulative FDI in a place like Africa is by multinationals from the past, from the EU and the US. But the growth rate, that is to say the faucet coming into the bathtub, is tremendous by the South. But the bathtub is filled with investment from the past of the EU and US multinationals. There are 2 points I want to make in addition about the character of South-South trade and how it is going to affect and is affecting northern multinationals. First, there's a lot of protectionism among the South with each other. Much has been made about the fact that the South complains about protectionism by the North. If you look at the numbers, in fact, there's a lot of high tariffs that Southern multinationals face against Southern multinationals as they're trading with each other. So President Obama is in Brazil today. Issue numero uno on the economic agenda in Brazil is the trade imbalance with China, very similar to what our main concern is. Second issue is there are significant asymmetries at present between the wealthier southern countries such as Brazil and China and India versus the poorer southern countries. So in the case of Africa, again, most of Africa's exports to the southern states are commodities in raw form, whereas the exports coming to the African, the poorer countries, we could also look at poorer Asian countries or poorer Latin American countries, are in the form of manufactured, high-valued goods. Now, why is this of concern to northern multinationals? It's because the South, or emerging markets, are the engine of global growth. 60% of GDP growth of the world is coming out of the emerging markets. It has been for several years, and the IMF and the World Bank predict that share is going to go even higher. In fact, if you look at growth, the record of global growth between emerging markets on the one hand and advanced countries on the other, over a very long period of time, from 1960 to 2010, you'll see that they're quite coupled up until the year 2000, where it breaks, and it's the same pattern, but there's a structural shift in the growth rates, and emerging market countries are at a much higher trajectory now than the North. And during the global economic crisis, it turns out, on average, that the emerging markets were far more resilient to the shocks of the global financial crisis than were the advanced countries. Why is this a threat to the northern multinationals, and why will the South continue to be an engine of growth? Very simply, the North has a worse balance sheet in both the public and the private sector than the South, who are not in the process of deleveraging. The South doesn't have the legacy of obsolete technologies. They have a burgeoning middle class, which are going to continue to go through different inflection points. And they're going to integrate further and further into the international markets because of network trade, that is to say, the assembly of parts and so forth, at a much greater rate than the North did in earlier times. So what are going to be the real concrete implications for firms and workers from the North? First, the multinationals from the South are going to be competing against the North firms in Southern markets. So you'll see, as we have witnessed, Bharti Telecommunications in Africa is competing head-to-head against Vodafone and carving away what economists call first-mover advantages. Multinationals from the South, like multinationals from the North before them, are the best and the brightest in their domestic markets, and that is what makes them succeed abroad. Secondly, and which has caught a lot of news, is that multinationals from the South are also beginning to compete head-to-head against multinationals from the North in their home markets. Huawei, Tata Group, ArcelorMittal, these are all going to become household names as they compete in our home markets. And finally, which has become an incredibly cutting-edge issue, is that northern multinationals are becoming sideswiped as a result of this protectionism that I mentioned before among South-South countries. So for instance, footwear companies who have production facilities in China exporting their footwear into Brazil are now being subject to anti-dumping duties in Brazil and cannot find the help from the US government because this is occurring in third country markets. This is just the beginning of a trend as northern multinationals engage in a world that's beginning to be dominated by South-South trade and investment. Thank you.
Thank you. We're gonna have to be as efficient as possible with the next comment so we can have time for Q&A. You used to be in government, so we'll give you a little extra. James Manika published an amazing piece of research with McKinsey Global Institute, and it struck me today when I was listening to Bill Draper, where there's a point of view, particularly in the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, that it's the emerging companies, it's the new companies that are creating the innovation, the R&D, and the jobs. And it's an amazing statistic that there's less than 1% of the total number of US companies are US multinationals, and it's 74% of the R&D and half of the gains in labor productivity. So this is really an amazing statistic for the US economy. And what does it mean, James, in terms of how they're going to operate in this world that Harry was describing to us?
First of all, I think that Harry made some very good remarks about the role of multinationals, but just to build on your question, I think it's quite remarkable the contribution to growth and performance that US multinationals have made in the past and I think continue to make. So you made the point about the level of R&D investment. I think you'll find that even if you look at the contribution of multinational corporations to US productivity and growth, it's actually quite disproportionate to their numbers. But so as not to repeat the comments on multinationals, I'm sure we'll have a long conversation. Maybe perhaps what I could comment on is the place of the US economy in a very changing global economy that I think Harry alluded to. I think it's important to remember that we've just come through a pretty rough recession, and many advanced economies, including the US, are still going through the process of deleveraging. These are economies that had piled up an enormous amount of debt, and not just in the government sector, but also in the private sector, as well as in financial institutions, as well as households. So that's going to take a long time to work itself through, in contrast to many of the South-to-South nations, which had not piled up anywhere close to the same levels of debt, so that you have that imbalance. The other thing to keep in mind as well as context for most advanced economies, including the United States, is actually the job situation, which is we're in such a deep hole with where we are with jobs and what it's going to take to recover jobs, that's going to be an important consideration as we think about how the US economy improves. And then if you also then think about the changing nature of global competition for both, if you look at the national level as well as at the company level, it's shifted quite a bit. So one of the striking things is if you think about it from the point of view of companies, and you think about how do companies think about where to invest and where to participate, you can put those considerations typically into sort of 4 categories. One category of consideration is how attractive is an economy that they're going to participate in. And attractiveness here takes into account, is the GDP growing? Are there consumers that can spend and buy products, goods, and services, and so forth? And so that's an important consideration. And I think as Harry pointed out, much of that attractive growth is no longer here, but in emerging countries. So that starts to shift the competitiveness and attractiveness one way. A second consideration takes into account the business environment that companies operate in. And that's everything from regulatory policy to tax rates to incentives to invest and participate. And you find that many countries, particularly in Asia and in the rest of the world, have actually dramatically improved how attractive their economies are compared to the US economy on the kind of business and regulatory environment. And then third, you look at the talent profile. I think it used to be inarguable that if you looked at all the talent and worker considerations, the US was by far quite attractive. The other countries have actually made significant gains in making themselves more attractive in terms of talent. And then you also look at, you pointed out about infrastructure, which is an important consideration when companies think about where to participate. So as you look at these 4 categories and even the specific metrics within each of those, if you had looked at the United States 10 years ago, the United States was in either the leading country or in the top quartile across many of the metrics you'd look at across those 4 categories. If you look at today, the US is still ahead, but its leadership position is eroded quite a lot from what it was just 10 years ago. And if you project forward, unless the US does something different, you may start to see in the next 2 or 3 decades, other economies start to look more attractive. So that's an important context as we think about what the US has to do. Now, if you look at the other important consideration for the US, which brings us back to the topic of innovation and productivity. One of the striking differences and changes that's occurred in the US economy, if you compare it, say, if you compare the 70s to now, is that productivity and innovation has become the primary driver of economic growth for the US. In the 70s, if you had looked at what was contributing, say, to GDP growth, a full 2/3 of the contributions came from the fact that the labor force and labor inputs were expanding quite dramatically. This was driven by women entering the workforce, the baby boomers starting to work, and that made 2/3 of the contributions to GDP growth. And only 25% came from productivity gains and innovation. If you look now, it's now flipped completely the other way, where we now rely 80% for our GDP growth and growth. We rely on innovation and productivity, and only 20% comes from expansions and labor inputs. So that says we're now so much more dependent on innovation and productivity. And that's where you start to see some of these metrics about what's going on in the US economy for innovation that make you start to worry. The fact that we're not investing as much in STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. we're not investing as much to drive innovation and growth in the same ways that the US economy used to do. We have large sectors in the economy that are not as productive as they could be, and think about healthcare and the public sector and education, which have not made as big contributions to productivity that some of the other sectors have. You look at our infrastructure, which is a necessary platform to drive innovation. So you start to look at all those challenges that we have, and you realize that unless we get back on an innovation agenda where we think about productivity and innovation, we're going to have limits to the rate at which the US economy can grow. I'll stop at that point. I'm sure we'll get into some of these comments when we get into our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker, Gideon Rockman, just published this book called Zero-Sum Future. And I feel like Oprah. I'd encourage you to A, get a copy in the back, and B, ask Gideon to sign it for you. It's a tremendous book. It's a little bit of a scary title, though. You know, we've heard about this exciting growth in the South-South commerce and the emerging markets, the challenges to U.S. multinationals, to the labor pool in the U.S. And it's a very interesting thesis. Is it a zero-sum future? You know, how does the U.S. engage with increasingly muscular China and other parts of the world? And, you know, what are your views?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening and that I talk about in the book is that really, perhaps until the financial crisis of 2008, the dominant view, certainly among elites in America, was that globalization was essentially a win-win, that it was beneficial to the countries that were developing very fast, but also economically beneficial to the United States. And it was politically beneficial as well, because it was helping to change the world in ways that the US would find congenial by, for example, spreading democratic and liberal values. And I think that that thesis is now, at the very least, under challenge, so that economically, the US and the Western world as a whole feels under much more pressure than it did before the financial crisis, and looks at countries like China, Brazil, India, and sees that they're doing really rather well. And there's also a sense that, well, there's a political challenge underway as well, that this has political consequences for the West's ability to get its way in the world. And if you want to put it quite starkly, that before we thought that, well, maybe a more prosperous, more powerful China needn't impinge on American power or prosperity. But now I think there's a sense, well, actually, there is a bit of a competition underway. And interestingly, I don't think leaders are yet prepared to put it in that way. If you see when Obama went to China about 18 months ago, he explicitly said this isn't a zero-sum world. It's one of the things that gave me the idea for the title of the book. And similarly, David Cameron, our Prime Minister, when he went to India, said this is not a zero-sum world. It's a kind of almost ritualistic thing. But the effort they put into denying this suggests to me that the question is at least at the back of their minds. You know? And so we're in a rather sort of plastic moment, I think, now, in which there is a growing sense of economic and strategic rivalry, particularly with China. And the US-Chinese relationship is, in a sense, a microcosm of a broader shift in power from west to east, of economic power and therefore of political power. And that is going to be an uncomfortable process. It may be, with wise leadership in the long run, a manageable process, but it's not going to be this, what was, if you like, this kind of liberal dream of the pre-2008 period, that we were all going to basically be one happy, democratic, free market world, and these political conflicts would somehow be submerged. And to get a little bit more specific on the US-Chinese relationship, I think that in the last couple of years you've seen a reassessment on both sides of the Pacific about, well, what does this mean? I think that the Chinese adopted, over the last 30 years of globalization, a rather wise policy of what they called peaceful rise. Essentially, they twigged that the globalized world was very good for them, that they could become much more prosperous, much quicker, and they chose to, as Deng Xiaoping advised them, don't assert leadership, don't hide your potential, just become more prosperous gradually. They took a very long-term strategic view. I think there's been a slight change of mood since 2008, and you see a more assertive China on a range of issues, whether it's willing to face down the United States in the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen, to be more assertive over the currency issues, and indeed to be relatively open about a military build-up. So there was this extraordinary moment when Robert Gates, the US Defense Secretary, was in Beijing recently, had been making rather nervous noises about the Chinese military build-up, and rather than reassure him, they actually test a new stealth fighter while he's there. And so there's a sense there that things are changing. And I think on the US side, Obama started by really going some way to try to cultivate a much more friendly relationship with China, and I think has been disappointed by how things have gone. I've mentioned the clashes over climate, currency, and the concerns over the military relationship. And as a result, you do have a more adversarial and more difficult relationship. And that's now playing itself out into a kind of diplomatic contest that's emerging. So I'd like to just finish by bringing in the other emerging powers, because it's not just a US-China story. You mentioned that I was in Brazil earlier this week, and I must say I was slightly wondering, why am I in Brazil? Because, you know, I write about international politics, and Japan was in meltdown, the Middle East was at war, and I was in Brazil. But then I noticed that Obama was also coming to Brazil. So I thought, well, maybe he and I know something, or I knew. But the reason that he hasn't cancelled this trip and that he's gone ahead with it is that I think that the big strategic view that the Americans have and the Obama administration have is that the big story of the next 20 years, maybe of the next century, is what Harry and others were talking about, the rise of new emerging economic powers, and that will have political consequences. And that America has been distracted too much by the Middle East. You keep being sucked back into it. You spend money, time, energy, human lives in the Middle East. And yet, if you look at how the world's changing, the really historic changes are the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil. And their position on Libya was really quite interesting. You know, they abstained. It was the West that said, we've got to get in there and sort it out. Britain, France voted in favor. The US voted in favor. The BRICS, the emerging powers, said, no, we're just going to sit on the sidelines. And that's part of this strategy that I was describing, where China says, we don't want to get involved in conflict. We're going to concentrate on economics. And in the long term, that growing economic power is going to be what delivers us political power. And I think that's rather an astute observation. It may not be the most moral position in the world, but in terms of political power, it's probably quite intelligent. And that's, I think, why you saw the reluctance on Obama's side to get involved in the Middle East once again. You know, you've already got the Iraq, the Afghan wars, you've got this huge budget deficit, you've got pressure on military budgets. Do you really want another draining conflict in the Middle East? When, in fact, the big story, as I say, is these other countries, China's, the India's, the Brazil's, which are becoming more economically powerful. The final point, I think, is that I think the major contest is between the US and China, and there is an effort by both sides to woo intermediaries. Obama, having seen the attempt at a rapprochement with China not working terribly well, is, I think, now trying to pull back other countries towards the US point of view, which again is partly why he's in Brazil. If you take the Copenhagen climate talks, I think it was a real wake-up call for America, because there'd been an assumption really by both the Obama and McCain campaigns in their rhetoric that, well, the democratic world gets along together, we democracies will essentially have a community of interests on a range of issues. In Copenhagen, Obama literally is shut out of the room and comes in and finds the Chinese sitting there with the Brazilians, the Indians, South Africans, and they have a position that is not shared by the United States. Again, on currency, the US has been trying to rally interest on their position that China's undervalued currency is a real problem. Yet when the Brazilians talk about a currency war, actually they're criticizing the United States' policy of quantitative easing, not the Chinese currency policy, at least not initially. So the US has, in the last year, made a big effort to try to win over the Indias, the Brazils. It's not a coincidence, not only that Obama was in Brazil this week, but that he was in India in November, the longest state visit he's had of his period in office. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this. America waking up, if it can avoid having all its energy sucked into the Middle East, to these big emerging economic trends and trying to shape the politics that is emerging out of the shift in economic power. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gideon. Please continue to send your messages up. We'll go for another 20, 25 minutes and cut into the break a little bit. But Gideon, I'm actually going to stay with you just for a second, go out of order here. If you take climate, which I think is a really interesting aspect to look at, COP15 was a failure. I think everybody in the climate discussion would agree with that. And yet, what do the Chinese do? Immediately after that, they start investing, creating standards around wind, solar, clean energy, and spending on a smart grid in China in 1 year what is multiples of what a 5-year plan is that Stephen Chu has for the United States. And so they're really setting the standard now for technology in clean energy, knowing that they've got an enormous environmental problem on a scale that they appreciate. They can't quite slow it down fast enough. But, you know, it's fascinating to see them taking the center stage from a policy standpoint as well, where, you know, our government doesn't seem to be able to get it right.
Well, I think it comes back to this old argument about the relative efficacy of democracies and autocracies. And I think that we in the West perhaps drew a lesson from the end of the Cold War that as Reagan put it, freedom works, and it works in all respects, that our system is not only politically preferable for reasons of liberal values, but it's actually just much more efficient. And I think that gradually, as China has continued to boom despite not, as many predicted, becoming a democracy, that question about, well, maybe they are capable of governing themselves quite well, of taking a long-term view of on things like climate, making the investments that we appear to be failing to make, has perhaps made us look a little bit more respectfully at the Chinese authoritarian model. I mean, it's very striking that if you talk to some American entrepreneurs, they're quite sort of taken by what's going on in China in terms of infrastructure and so on. And yet, of course, the weaknesses are still there as well. So that, you know, I don't want to get the guy in trouble, but one of the prominent American businessmen, as an example of how efficient China was, said to me, you know, they're building 20 nuclear power stations when we can't get any through. Well, you know, this week that doesn't seem possibly as smart a decision as people thought. I mean, maybe it will be in the long run, but they've had to suspend their construction now. And it's both the strength and the weakness of an authoritarian system that it can make these decisions, take a long-term view, but if you make a long-term mistake, you pay for it.
I was going to add to that on this question of investment and innovation, I think it's important to keep two things in mind. So yes, you look at the rates at which China is trying to invest, and you could easily get worried. I mean, yes, China now is just eclipsed the United States in being the leading exporter of high-tech products. In fact, they now make up 30% of the global export of high-tech products. You look at the rate at which they're graduating engineers, it's actually quite striking. If you look at engineering, for example, I think in 2009, China graduated about 10,000 engineering PhDs versus the US, which only graduated about 8,000. By the way, the US, 8,000, 2/3 of those were actually not American citizens, although they got their PhDs here, right? So you can look at these rates of patents and so forth, and they could be quite worrying. But I think it's important to also just step back and look at the absolutes. The United States still invests $400 billion more in R&D than the next 4 countries combined in sheer absolute terms. You look even at venture capital, 50% of all the venture capital given to startups is still in the world is still given to US companies, to US startups. So I think while the rates of growth in China, yes, are quite stunning, the absolute still suggests that the US is still leading. But that's not to say the US should be complacent either, right? Because if those investments don't turn into large-scale transformations or businesses or jobs or innovations in the economy, then yes, there is a lot to worry about.
I'm going to stay with you for a second, James. By the way, your comment on PhDs is interesting because Bill Draper in a breakout session this morning, you know, made a comment, you know, we're educating foreigners in our finest academic institutions at the highest level, and then we're asking them to leave because they can't get a visa. It just doesn't seem very smart to do that, and I think that's something that I think most people agree with. But you have an interesting job at McKinsey as in running your operation there, and you have the benefit of talking to many, many CEOs because of the reach of McKinsey and the excellence of your institution. I'd be curious if you could share, when you talk to the CEOs of multinationals, we've come through an era where people have criticized our current United States administration as being anti-business and obviously trying to warm a little more. But what do they ask? What's on their wish list? What's stopping them from hiring more, investing more, reaching more? What are the issues?
Well, I think it's a few different things. I think first, in terms of what's on their mind, one of the continuous refrains you hear is the fact that the U.S. is not doing enough to make this continue to be the most competitive economy to participate in if you're a multinational. Because if you're a large corporation, you're looking at, the world is now where you play. You can play in pretty much any geography in any country. And if you look at the rate at which other places have become more attractive and creating environments that are more attractive to multinationals, it's now changed the calculus for most multinational corporations, where it was an obvious decision to choose to invest in the US. It's no longer that simple anymore, because you have economies that are growing that are elsewhere. You have talent that's attractive that is elsewhere. You have business and regulatory environments that are more attractive elsewhere. So that's sort of starting to change the calculus. And some of the specific issues you hear have to do with either the concerns about tax rates, concerns about regulation, concerns about R&D incentives, and a variety of issues. So that's a lot of what you hear. To your question about why aren't they hiring, yes, it is true that if you look at, in fact, I think JP Morgan just put out a report recently that points out that there's something like over $1 trillion on corporate balance sheets. Why aren't they investing? I think there's a very straightforward answer to that. Most of that money is actually not even here. And close to half of it has been gained in operations around the world. And it's extraordinarily expensive, actually, for corporations to repatriate that money back, if you look at the corporate tax rates. So if not for no other reason alone, it has not been easy for corporations to repatriate that money back and invest it here. The other reason that's making it very difficult for corporations to very quickly start hiring again is that the demand in the US economy is actually not that robust. So even though the economy is recovering, demand is not that robust. Keep in mind that for the last 2 decades, the US economy, 71% of the growth from the US economy has been driven by consumer spending. 71%. This economy, more than any other, relies disproportionately on consumer spending. If you take into account that consumers are either, many of them are not employed, they are no longer able to spend on the basis of either debt-driven spending, either from credit cards or mortgages. So in fact, their ability to spend and therefore sustain the robustness of that demand has been impaired quite a bit. So for an economy that relies as much as it does on consumer spending, and that consumer spending has not been as robust, you see a weak demand. So if you're a corporation and you're making choices about, do I rapidly start to hire in the face of weak demand, that's difficult. And on the margin, you find that some corporations are actually hiring where the demand is, and that's actually in other countries. So that's part of what's, I think, on the minds of many large corporations.
I think that those corporations that can't get the money offshore, Senator Kerry referred to as Ben Franklin corporations. But Harry, it's a question for you, and it takes you back to your USTR background, so we'll take you back a few years. And the question is, what's the relevance of the WTO these days? And thinking about that question, you've talked about business and capital flows that are almost a step ahead of what the traditional WTO landscape was. And so how do you look at that?
Well, I think, I think the WTO is very important from the sense of setting out rules of the game, in the sense of setting out market disciplines, particularly for countries that are emerging markets. In fact, one of the biggest users of the WTO is China, in terms of filing cases of unfair trade practices. It's also an important fora for discussing all the issues that I've been talking about in terms of the South-South protectionism. Another way of putting it is imagine a world without a governing body that oversees the world trading system. And this is a raging debate, of course, in Washington and in other capitals about not having a multilateral trading system, but having a world of bilateral trade agreements or regional trade agreements, which has obviously been happening increasingly. It's not obvious, at least to me, that a world in which you have, in essence, a spaghetti bowl of regional trade agreements is going to reduce poverty, going to increase jobs, increase foreign direct investment and trade in such a way that both increases these things for domestic populations, jobs, poverty reduction, but also increases profits for shareholders. So I think there's, one of the disappointments, of course, in the not completing the Doha round, which is not yet dead, maybe close, but not yet dead, has been not strengthening further the multilateral trading system. But I think history shows, quite well that this has served the world quite well in terms of propelling growth. And I dare say that the South has an interest in having this multilateral trade system get stronger.
I'm going to stay with you, Harry. There's a comment here, and it's interesting, is how can the U.S. take a long-term view when each president brings in a new team, often with a significant learning curve and international issues?
Well, so staying with USTR, I think, is a great case in point. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where, as Tim mentioned, I worked, is a very small organization, maybe 200, 300 people. It's in the executive office of the president. There are probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 people, 7 people who are political appointees. The rest of the staff are civil service. And this is what distinguishes USTR from many other line agencies. In fact, I would not even call USTR a line agency. It is really an honest broker among the line agencies. And it serves, frankly, the US public well, because there is not a lot of rotation out of USTR. Now, you might think, so you've got a lot of bureaucrats. Well, these are really sharp trade specialists and negotiators, and you want to have people who have this kind of institutional memory in such a fleet-footed, agile organization. And when you compare that particular organization to its counterparts in other G8 or G7 or G20 countries, you're hard-pressed to find a similar organization. So I think, at least in the area of trade, this is what is serving various presidents quite well.
Gideon, there's a couple questions here I'll try to put together that I think are difficult political judgments, and also came in some of the sessions this morning. There's a bit of a view that since China is not a democracy and there's some amount of social unrest that happens in that country, increasing protest, environmental degradation, and that they still haven't gone over that bump in the road, as we've seen in the Middle East with these Twitter revolutions. And yet, when you look at China and you look at the happiness quotient, and do citizens feel positive about their country, and their nationalism is very, very high. In fact, higher in China than it is in almost any other country in the world today. So how do you sort of politically see that evolving? I mean, do you see that as a major risk in China, or do you look at the leadership and just admire how they're managing?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the political system in China is immutable, is going to be there forever. I don't think it's fundamentally stable. I think there has been a long-term trend towards democracy, literally over centuries. I mean, if you count the number of democracies at the beginning of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, the line is only going one way, and I don't think that China will be immune from that forever. That said, I think that we were perhaps too glib in thinking, particularly in 1989, which we remember was the year of Tiananmen, but also the year of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, that the Chinese system couldn't possibly resist this democratic trend forever. I think if you had said to people then, you know what, in 20 years' time, the Chinese economy will be 400% larger, but it will still be run by the Communist Party, nobody would have believed you. They would have thought, well, there's a choice to be made here. And so it may be that this Chinese system has many more years to run, partly because, as you say, it's been doing rather a good job in creating prosperity, so that the Chinese leaders, although palpably nervous about what was happening in the Middle East, also said, I think with some justice, look, we are rather different because we've produced these very rapid growth rates. Plus, you know, they're on the ruthless end of the spectrum, so they're going to crack down. You know, if they're going to be a Mubarak or a Gaddafi, well, I'm not sure. But I think the final point to make is that I think that the people who say this is a politically unstable system and there's instability ahead are right. At some point there will be a big transition, it will be bumpy. But I think that doesn't mean that takes away the China growth story, the China challenge story. You know, China is going to be a major power, perhaps the major power of the coming century, more or less whatever happens politically. And just to give you an idea, and the analogy with Germany is sometimes made in terms of a rising power. Well, Germany was a country that went through massive instability. It went through the First World War, the Second World War, the Great Depression, hyperinflation, and yet it emerged at the end of 1945. By the 1950s, it was once again one of the leading economies in the world. So I think the idea that political instability will kind of end the economic story in China, and therefore the story of China as a rising power, is a mistake.
I'd like to sort of add a little bit to that. I think the Chinese have been very smart. I think they've also been very lucky. They have a very large internal market, which has allowed them, in essence, to muddle through. Their banks are not commercial banks as we know them. Their state-owned enterprises are not commercial enterprises.
Neither are some of ours.
As we know, absolutely. I believe in the convergence theory, right? So I think, you know, I think there is a soft underbelly of the Chinese economy, and I think one should not rule out a potential crisis in the economic fabric of China, and that, along with political instability, could be a problem.
James, there's some comments here that are embedded in a few questions about, you know, your research on technology and R&D, and you know that high margin jobs, and is that enough for the United States?
Well, I think the question on jobs is interesting. I mean, I think often when we talk about jobs, it's often couched in the context of what's happened with manufacturing, and in the sense that those are good jobs. I think it's important to remember that manufacturing, from a jobs point of view, has been in decline for the last 40 years. It really has been. So this is not something that the recent recession has created. This has been a long-standing trend of decline of jobs in manufacturing, to the point where now jobs in manufacturing make up only about 11% of the economy. So I think it's important to remember that. I think if you're asking the question of where are the so-called high-quality jobs, it's also important to remember that if you look at the net new jobs that have been created in the US economy, and actually in most advanced economies, by the way, in the last 2 decades, they've all been in the service sector. And those are sectors that have the full range in terms of quality of jobs, from, yes, some relatively low-wage service jobs, but also some very high-end service jobs. So from a job creation point of view, the history, and quite frankly, even you look, both the last 2 decades and prospectively the next 2 for sure, most jobs are going to come from the service sector. That's going to come, and it's going to be a full range of mix in terms of the quality of jobs, if quality is measured by wages for each job.
Harry, there's a question here. It's a very direct question. Do you think we will be facing countervailing trade duties in the United States? Saying there's a question was raised, was do you feel there will be countervailing trade duties in the United States, particularly against China?
In other words, will we be enacting?
The prognosticator of it.
I think there's certainly a mood in the Congress to either perhaps do it legislatively or for certain people in the executive branch or the International Trade Commission or the Department of Commerce. But I think the probability of that happening is close to zero. I don't see that much is going to be accomplished politically or economically by going down that route.
Thank you. And Gideon, I think we will leave the last question for you, and you can take your time with it a bit. How do you think about this world where there's two or possibly more hegemon as opposed to a more unitary superpower?
Well, I don't think we're yet in a two-superpower world, but we're moving in that direction. So that I think that there was a period of time, perhaps between the end of the Cold War, 1989, to the, if you like, the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, when America was economically and politically really at the core of the global system and was essential to anything that happened. And that's beginning to change. I think that, look, there are many consequences that flow from that. One is this risk of rivalry as a sense of relative decline in American power and a more assertive new powers come up, in particular China. And that is accentuated not only by the size of the Chinese economy, and I think it's worth noting that, that there was a projection in The Economist just before Christmas that the Chinese economy will be the world's largest by 2019. And that will be really quite a moment, because that will be the first time for a century and more that the world's largest economy is not a democracy, assuming we haven't had that political change by then. And that will pose all sorts of questions for how we view the world. Now, I don't think that there's a direct read across in a sort of mathematical way from economic power to political power, that you have X size of economy, therefore you have X amount of political power. It's more complicated than that. And that I think that, even at the point where the Chinese economy were to become the largest economy in the world, the US would probably still be the center of the global political system, because it's got the habit of leadership, because international institutions have embedded American leadership into it, and perhaps because its values are more attractive. And just as a kind of illustration of that, it's quite striking that on the Libyan crisis, Britain and France took the lead. Yeah. By the size of their economies, you wouldn't expect that, but they have permanent membership of the UN Security Council. They still think globally. So I think America will remain the most powerful country in the world for quite a while, but I think that its ability and its willingness to lead will gradually diminish. And you see that again, if you look at the Libya crisis, in Obama's reluctance to get involved, the sense, really for the first time that I can remember, that American presidents are willing to explicitly say, actually, there's a limit to our resources. There are things that we can't always afford to do. When the speech he gave on committing troops to Afghanistan, it was very striking, I thought, that he explicitly said, look, these things cost. We, as a deficit nation, can't afford doing this indefinitely. So there's that. So there's a sense of diminished American power and a rising economic and political power in other nations. And then final point on that, it's not just nation to nation. I think that one of the characteristics of the world that we face is that a hell of a lot of the issues that we face are global, by definition global issues, that no one country, however powerful, can solve on its own. That's why they have this odd prefix, the global economic imbalances, global climate change. There's a sense that nations know that they have to try and solve them together. That's why we have the G20, a whole paraphernalias of attempts to discuss these things. But I think that on issue after issue, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change, whether it's nuclear proliferation, these countries are deadlocked. They're not getting the international agreements. They can agree that they need to agree, but they can't get beyond that. Yeah. And that's partly because, I think, they're intrinsically difficult issues, national interests clash, but also because there is now no longer a really paramount, dominant power in the system. And therefore, there's nobody able to, in the end, say, okay, well, this is how it's going to be, the way it's going to be. So that after the global economic crisis, there was much talk of the need for a new Bretton Woods. But if you think back to Bretton Woods, when those institutions were created in 1944, 45, America was so much the most powerful country at that conference that in the end, they designed the solution. And even the British, we sent along Lord Keynes, etc., but we weren't totally happy with what came out of it, but we had to accept it because America was the most powerful country. When you get to the climate change negotiations, the trade negotiations, and a whole panoply of political issues, you're getting deadlock. And I think that's a real problem for the world because these are issues that need to be solved, but at the moment we don't have the political climate or the political mechanisms for fixing them.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Gideon will be in that corner over there to sign books for those of you who would like to purchase one.